Great. Welcome, everyone. This is the second session where we've got people from the summer-winter school presenting their thesis. And we've got one, and there'll be a second editor from the Diverse Economies and Livable Worlds book series joining us in a little bit. So the ask, or I might actually, what we might do first is just do a little go round, and if everybody can say where they are, and maybe just a little bit about their connection to the summer-winter school, or Andrea, their not connection to the summer-winter school. So I might I'll work around my screen. So Sangwon.
Hello, I'm here in Oxford, UK, 7 a.m. in the morning. And I did my summer school in Norway in person node in 2024.
2024, yeah.
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 And I met Katherine while in my field of my PhD before that.
Yes. And you've just done your Viva, and the thesis the final version is due at the beginning of December.
Yes. I'll be submitting my correction until the beginning of December, and that will be official done with my PhD.
Congratulations.
And Tom.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning. My name is Tom. I'm in the north of Spain, so it's 8 a.m. and I'm just waiting for the sun to come up over the mountains outside, so it should get brighter as the session goes on. Yeah, and I helped to deliver or facilitate the summer school for 2 years. For 2 years, I think 2022, 2023 it would have been. So yeah, I don't think I know some names and faces, and we've met a few of us, but I don't think anyone was part of that when I was involved. So it's nice to get to meet you guys.
And Tom is also our wonderful coordinator of Liviana, doing a fantastic job. Gilles.
Hi everyone, my name is Gilles. So I joined summer school in 2023 in Norway, and with a group of very enthusiastic LECARA researchers as myself, and then also Katherine was there with Elizabeth, and then so we had a nice time reflecting on our research. I really appreciated that, and I defended my PhD in May last year. And I am now in Luxembourg, same time as Tom and the others in the western part of Europe. So now I'm still working on topics related to community economies, but focusing more on urban development, even though in my PhD I focus more on the transformational aspect, and then how they resist the tension that are set by legal framework. So in a while, I will talk a bit about that in my presentation. But yeah, I'm happy to join you this morning to present also my thesis, and then also discuss some potential ideas with you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Gilles. Colm.
Hey everyone. So I'm based in Athens in Greece, and I also took part of the summer school in Norway in 2024. And I defended my PhD in April, last April.
Right. Thanks. Nikolai.
Koto, I'm in Aotearoa, New Zealand, so the sun is setting here. But I did the school twice, kind of accidentally. The first time before I even officially enrolled in my thesis, but one of my colleagues was sick, so I took their place in 2022. And then in 2024, it was at my university, and there are a few spots, and I thought I could beat my mark from the first time. So yeah, but very excited to hear the work. And thanks, Tom, for all your organizing. Kia ora.
Right. Thanks, Nikolai. Andrea.
Yes. Hi. Thanks so much for having me. I am doing a PhD in Stockholm, at the Stockholm University. I'm somewhere in the middle of my PhD, and I actually really wanted to join the summer school this summer, but I was out in Spain actually doing field work. So perhaps I manage to join you all next year. I've been hearing so many great things about the summer school. Yeah, I'm working a little bit with worker cooperatives and other types of cooperatives in my project. So hopefully next year I'll have stories that don't include failing the course or the summer school, Nikolai. We keep this only for as your unique experience. But yeah, I hope it's okay to be here again. I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of a close thing. I've been following the group for a while, and it's great to be here to see what people finish their PhD with. So yeah, here for inspiration.
It's great to have you here, Andrea. So welcome.
Thanks.
And Ella.
Hi everyone, I'm Ella. I'm in Sheffield in the UK, and I did the summer school in 2023 and submitted my PhD in January 2024. So it feels like I'm kind of stepping back in time a little bit, but in a way that's really refreshing and nice. So really happy to be here.
Oh, great. And I have to say, it wasn't organized, but I just, when I sat down this evening to look at everyone's what school, which node you did, I realized you all did the Norway node. But that was not by design. And it was also lovely to see too in two of the titles about living together as being a lovely theme that cuts across some of the work as well. So just to let everybody know, the instructions to our presenters were to focus on...
You haven't asked me.
Oh, Kath, I'm sorry. I didn't get all the way around.
No.
Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, and then you can go too.
Then I can go.
Hi, everybody. I'm Katherine or Kath, and I'm joining you from Canberra in Australia. So it's, yeah, it's supposed to be getting towards the end of the day. The sun's still up though, because we're now in summertime. And I taught the 2022 summer school face-to-face in Massachusetts with Kevin, and then the 2023 one with Zar in Norway, where Ella and Gilles were, I think. And then I think I must have taken, did I take 23, 24 last year? I taught the online Europe summer winter school with Lucy Svabova in, well, half of the time we were in Germany and the other half we were in the Netherlands. Is that right? Have I missed anything?
And no, that was this year. You had last year off.
I had last year off. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I did have a year off. Anyway, so I've had a mixture of, I still have very vivid memories of our party in Norway where Gilles was plying me with some incredible liqueur, if I remember rightly. Anyway, it's lovely. What was it?
That's great.
Something.
Yeah.
It was a Jägermeister, yeah.
That's Jägermeister. I had no idea what it was. And then I had a nice meeting with Sangwon in Paris this year, just before I came back to Australia. So, and that cough I had turned out to be pneumonia, I found out later on. So I've been suffering a little bit of ill health. So anyway, great to see you all. And so Jen, introduce yourself now.
Yeah, thanks, Kath. So Jenny Cameron, hi everyone. You do the admin and curriculum development for the summer winter school and have facilitated all of them online nodes. So the first year was Australasia. Then the second year I did an Americas online node, but from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is where I'm located. So I was doing it the day after the Americans were doing it. And it was interesting. The timetabling was interesting because it was sort of, I was ahead and behind of everybody. And then the last 2 years I've done the Asia Pacific online node and loved every node, had a great time. Wonderful to connect with people through the summer winter school. And Shangji's joining us. He did the summer winter school this year in Norway. I'll just say a little bit about the instructions for the 3 presenters that we've got. And the instructions were, because out of a thesis, which is a huge document, what are you going to do in 20 minutes? And so the presenters have received a number of emails from me that have said, focus on one main point only. So, and that main point might come from the whole thesis, or it might just come from a chapter of the thesis. So, how do you distill in 20 minutes a huge piece of work down into a very small presentation? Focusing on one main idea is one way to do it. And then what Kath and Stephen know that our presenters are focusing on one main idea, and we're encouraging them to sort of respond and think with our participants about the one main idea that they're presenting. And the idea with getting the series editors from the Diverse Economies and Livable Worlds book series to be respondents is that by being a book series editor, they're used to thinking at the sort of scale of a book or the scale of a thesis, and also used to seeing a whole range of work. So there's sort of people who are ideally located to be able to give a response to people who are going to present on their theses. So we'll go in the order that they're in the program. So that will be Sangwon, and then Gilles, and then Ella. I think that's right. And they've got 20 minutes, which I'll time. And what we'll do after each 20 minutes, we'll just do a little bit of moving around, but we'll have our 3 presentations, and then we'll invite Kath to give a response. And if Stephen joins us, he'll be invited to give a response. And then we'll also get the presenters then if they want to say anything back to Kath and Stephen. And then if we've got time, we'll open it up to hear from everybody. But Sangwon, are you okay to go to share screen and get yourself?
Of course. Just
Great. And I will put my timer on 20 minutes. I'll tell you when we're at about the 18-minute mark or so.
Can you see my screen?
Yep. Do you want to do it full screen? Yep, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, shall we make a start?
Yes, I will press start on my timer.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining this session from different places and different time zones. And thank you, Katherine, Jenny, and Stephen for organizing this session and engaging with the work of CEI Summer Winter School alumni. For the next 20 minutes, I will share some of my findings and reflections on the makings of alternative urbanism in Seoul, South Korea, especially with regard to the ways in which money and finance can be rethought of as a vehicle for making other urban worlds possible. Although I will present only a small part of my PhD that is directly relevant to the diverse economy scholarship, my dissertation as a whole has been inspired and shaped a lot by the core theories, concepts, and methodology that I have learned during the summer school in Trondheim. This is a little bit of my table contents, and today I will mainly talk about money, finance, and modern capitalist subjectivities that constitute the urban as a site of ethical interdependencies and different possibilities. Sitting at the intersection of so-called global polycrisis and planetary urbanization, my PhD puts forward the modest theorization of alternative urbanism as the ethical coming together of strangers that leads to alternative modes of collective city life. In other words, in response to relentless pessimism that animates most critical urban literatures, I theorize alternative urbanism to mark out a conceptual springboard that is attentive to diverse instantiations in which mutual interdependencies between urban dwellers are explored, cultivated, and negotiated. Among others, in this presentation, I will focus on money and finance as a different entry point to exploring particular facets of alternative urbanism in the making. In particular, if it can be argued that to think about the urban is to think about the coming together of strangers, the diverse economy scholarship provides a generative conceptual optic to explore money and finance as a means through which modern capitalist subjectivities emerge, and in the process of their coming together, alternative urban presents and futures are imagined, assembled, and secured. Let me briefly do a little bit of scene setting. While financialization has now come to be understood as one of the dominant mechanisms by which contemporary neoliberal capitalism reproduces itself, Bittu and Yeonggeul have become buzzwords in the past few years in Korea, referring to a widespread act of individuals investing in real estate and stock markets by taking loans even beyond one's maximum capacity in expectation of high returns. In recognition of uncertainties and insecurities that have come to profoundly reshape most urban dwellers' everyday geographies, financial difficulties, both as a reality and a looming possibility, have become a gravitational constant of the urban everyday in Seoul. And in such a context, Seongmisan Maul, my case study, has faced numerous money problems in the developmentalist city Seoul that has long been saturated with property-led urban development projects and gentrification, as well as the speculative desires that they have aroused. At first glance, this allegedly alternative urban community might seem to reproduce one of the all too familiar stories of capitalist urbanization. However, upon closer look, what I observed in the local neighborhood was a crucible of urban and economic experimentations where a whole host of diverse economic activities proliferate, such as Roscas, community bank and currency, community stores and enterprises, and so on. And in this context, what struck me was that a number of local activists told me that the book Take Back the Economy has literally been their textbook and guideline when they were mapping out their community activities and projects. Only several months later, I got to know that it was not a coincidence that I met Katherine in July 2023 when she visited the community, gave a talk, and had a long-awaited catch-up with local activists. Against this backdrop, let me walk you through some of my empirical findings. Underpinning my exploration of modern capitalist economies of alternative urbanism is a fundamental concern for ethical finance and financial subjectivities, the ways in which individuals detach themselves from capitalist subjection amidst the financialization of the urban everyday. And in this regard, the following are various articulations of a politics of resubjectification, where people identify and hold on to shared modern capitalist financial subjectivities emerging from collective experiences and relations intermediated through money and finance, and in doing so, scope out multiple pathways for living well together financially and beyond. I believe explore modern capitalist subjectivities or even inventorying them can enrich the diverse economy scholarship. And out of many, I will talk about subjectivities of agency, care, and hope, all of which has appeared to be prominent in my case studies. So most community organizations and enterprises that I observed in the community are cooperatives. And one local activist explains why, and I quote, "We are living in a capitalist society where everything is thought of in relation to its economic values. So for example, when it comes to childcare, it is all about making money and profits out of all the services and stuff provided for childcare, not about mulling over better ways to raise kids. It is everywhere, like medical services and so on. So we have created alternatives like cooperative childcare facilities and a medical cooperative. I think cooperative is a great framework through which we can bring to life what we need in our daily lives by ourselves," unquote. Here, I'm not really interested in differentiating those cooperatives from capitalist businesses, although it remains pertinent to my case study. Instead, I am keen on understanding them or cooperativism as a manifestation of alternative mode of city life, which engenders different stances towards money and finance. For example, the medical cooperative that featured the previous quote organizes home visits once a week for those who have mobility issues for various reasons, which is a kind of service that most clinics in Korea do not offer due to its poor cost efficiency. In each home visit, while the doctor and the nurse give medical treatments, the social worker surveyed the patient's surroundings, such as familial and other kinds of support available for them, medical histories, financial status, daily routines, and social networks that could affect their overall well-being. And after each visit, the team compiled a list of measures that need to be taken for each patient, including not only prescriptions, but also other kinds of non-medical support that they could organize based on community-based resources. As the social worker said, and I quote, "It is not just about taking pills and seeing a doctor, unquote. Further, what struck me was the ways in which these weekly home visits are organized and made sense of in the community. She said, and I quote again, "We don't earn money from this. Actually, we lose it. But we do this because there are people who need this service, as you have seen today. The members of our cooperative support it. Their dues are used for these kind of activities. And it is not just some sort of altruism. We want to get old in this community, not in a random nursing home. Home visit is one of the things that we all will need at some point in the future," unquote. In contrast to a Korean style of elderly care commodification centered on hospitalization, the community has established the cooperative hospital to ensure different medical needs to be met, to offer medical practices in ways that are not feasible in the neoliberalized healthcare and welfare system of the country, which illustrates the manifestation of the collective subjectivity of agency that refuses to be subject of the dominant developmental urbanism. In the words of my research participants, we make what we need. The second subjectivity that I will illustrate is the subjectivity of care. Let me begin with the quote. In the first couple of years after establishing our organization, we didn't have a stable workspace for meeting and stuff, so we roamed about different cafes nearby every time we needed to meet. At the same time, however, we often felt exhausted because of the lack of our own space. We came to know that 함께주택, the local co-housing cooperative, has a vacancy, but the deposit, 100 million Korean won, exceeded our affordability way too much. But it was very well located in the middle of the community, and we really wanted it. So we booked a community pub Alu one day and invited local residents. A lot of people turned up, and we made a kind of presentation about what we would like to do and asked them for lending money. It is unbelievable how brave and bold we were in those days. But anyway, to our surprise, so many people readily offered different amounts of money according to their availability, and we were able to sign a lease soon thereafter, unquote. So around 70 people donated and 14 people lent money. The cooperative managed to move into its own home, as seen in this picture. At stake here is the emergence of subjectivity of care, which constitutes the kind of social relations that has made the local activists to be brave and bold enough to ask others for such a huge amount of money and hoping for their own place in such a speculative urban setting. What sets this subjectivity apart is a consciousness which underlies the act of using money, a recognition that money is itself a form of intermediation, which could foster different social norms and communities, not necessarily reinforcing the individualistic logic of consumerism. In other words, care is an organizing logic of the community and its economy, embodied through a complex web of money flow, which ensures the collective security of various community organizations and their activities taking place across the neighborhood. Recognizing the necessarily relational, interdependent nature of urban living, they consider the implications of their own spending beyond its capitalist individualized register, and cultivate themselves an awareness of more than capitalist values and norms, however elusive they might be. And underneath such elusive values and norms that animate the alternative urbanism in the making is the continuous identification of what is common between them or the common good, and asking what needs to be created and sustained for the sake of collective well-being of the community. The subjectivity of care emerges here, as commonly said by my research participants. Money is about priorities. It could be much more useful to others than it is to me right now. As such, and I quote, "This neighborhood is just like that. Everyone's money is distributed here and there," unquote. Along with such a radically different stance towards money, care comes to be a key organizing principle of economy across the community, allowing local activists and residents to be detached, at least temporarily, from the competitive game of consumerist subjects. While the subjectivities of agency and care are suggestive of the rise of modern capitalist subjects, a kind of apprehension is almost invariably found in such an exploration of subjects of community economies. The apprehension that processes of resubjectification are much likely to be partial and temporary, which therefore could easily be undone. Hence, it is important to explore what motivates people to commit to invigorate and sustain those community organizations and activities as spaces of collective possibilities nested simultaneously in the unequal dynamics of the powerful capitalist mode of urban living and its diverse yet seemingly fugitive alternatives. In this regard, the following quote are worth paying attention to, and I quote, "If we can't just overthrow the capitalist system, if we can't just break it down and get rid of it, I believe that we need to develop this kind of small community where various communities are constantly made, unmade, and remade, where people are connected to each other. But instead, all these grandiose concepts and discourses, to be more precise, I just like living here. It's much more comforting here that I don't have to live up to the competitive mindset of the society. So we need a cafe like this, a community bookstore, and so on, even though there are much more convenient and sometimes even cheaper options like franchise cafes and same-day or early morning deliveries and stuff. All the inconveniences and the bit pricey products that we need to afford to make use of community products and spaces, we should think of it as a kind of paying community tax, unquote." As she said, local activists and residents make seemingly irrational decisions in the perspective of the rational, calculative economic subject, basically pay more for less convenient products. This is an act of appreciating the alternative, life-enriching values and possibilities that those community organizations have brought about, and of hoping them to be enlivened and sustained, a manifestation of the subjectivity of hope. Here, hope does not lie in the promise of emancipatory politics of some kind. Rather, hope is grounded in the emerging possibilities of contextual collective becoming, through which economic differences are articulated, performed, and negotiated. This continuous process of becoming takes place in ways that foster a different set of transformation practices or disciplines of the self, in which embodied actions are undertaken so as to constitute new micro-worlds of affect and behavior, as Gibson Graham puts it. Such micro-worlds are not only illustrate a shared multiplicity of hope, but also spotlight the politics of hope, in which dominant capitalist desires are deconstructed and reworked through ordinary quotidian hopes for living well together. In other words, rather than a teleological sense of hope associated with overarching socio-political ideals, it is the everyday sensibilities of hope arising from the joy of collective city life that matters. Let me briefly share some of my reflections to conclude the presentation. In fact, the incapacity to think economy beyond this capitalist circumscription has been a fundamental challenge tirelessly lingering around myself and my research participants. And it makes me to take more than 6 months to write this single chapter. However, what becomes prominent in my case study is emergent ways in which various kinds of collective action are performed from within and through the very means that reproduces certain oppressive socio-economic and political structures, in this case, money and finance. And perhaps more importantly, seeing through the emergent more than capitalist objectivities, the capitalist economy itself is also always in the making and thus subject to be destabilized and transformed. Likewise, my PhD theorizes alternative urbanism as a conceptual springboard to account for and trace resonances between multiple other urban worlds that are already underway. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. And wonderful resonances with the first set of theses that we looked at last week, because two of them were on aspects of financialization, one looking at a Maori community housing organisation and the way in which it's using finances to enact ways of living together in a decolonial context, and another thesis that was looking at alternative food networks in the Australian context and the sort of diverse ways in which they were using finance. And they all had quotes from that chapter by Maliha and Yaya on from the financial chapter in the handbook on diverse economies. I think both of them use the quote about reading about finance against the grain. So it's lovely to see the finance theme being continued, and also Sangwon linking it with subjectivity is terrific. And I see Stephen has joined us too. And so Stephen, I know you're probably on the soccer field and can't put on your camera, but anyway, it's great that you're here and listening in. So Sangwon, thank you so much for that. So let's just take 2 minutes to stand and stretch while Gilles gets his PowerPoint up, and then we'll come back and we'll do the next 20 minutes. And Sangwon, thank you so much for presenting that so succinctly.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Gilles, if you just put it up and start sharing screen, and we'll just still take the little 2-minute break, mini break.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that right now.
Yep. No pressure.
Okay. Zoom. Share.
Right, here you go.
Do you see the full screen?
Yeah, perfect. That's great. And just check you can move forward to the next slide, okay?
Yes.
Yep, perfect, great. Well done. So we'll just wait for another moment or so. I'll just wait till I can see a few more faces there. So we'll just might wait for Colm to come back. Here's Andrea. Okay, great. So Gilles, when you're ready to start, once you start, I'll press the timer.
All right. Okay, so I can start now, perhaps.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, all right. So good morning again, everybody. My name is Gilles Essuman. I'm living in Luxembourg right now, working here. So today the purpose of my talk is from this huge chunk of pages of PhD thesis, I try to think of something much more interesting to talk about that could maybe stimulate some discussion or some reflection from all of us. Over the past few years that I've been working on community economies and also exploring literature that mobilize community economies, but beyond, let's say, our framework and our network, and it's quite common to come up with the words transition and just transitions and everything. So the talk today is to look a bit at how we go beyond the issues of transition and talk about transformation and how our community economy practices spearheading transformation at various social spatial scales. So the main idea is community economies are not merely transition niches, but they are transformational zones where new economic relations, institutions, and subjectivities are enacted, defended, and sedimented over time. So we can study rule changes, value regimes, and subjectivities as they stabilize, rather than just treating them as temporary pilots. And this is how I'm going to frame the most part of my discussion today. So why does this matter? It matters because policy transition discourses often treat community initiatives as adjuncts, useful supports to the real system changing elsewhere. But empirically, through our research and a lot of practices that we study, we see them reordering the rules and values of regimes happening inside initiatives themselves. And then I try to contextualize this through France because France has a long legal arc, visible policy interface, and also showcases some of the cooptation risks that come with recognition of such community economic practices. So yeah, the main takeaway from my talk is to treat community economies as sites of world making and not just tools of transition. But before then, I will try to talk a bit about what is the difference between transition and transformation. So the literature review that I did during my PhD and also in other readings show that transition, as defined by a lot of articles and then in terms of framing, refers to the movement from state A to state B. So it's directional and goal-oriented, typically subsystemic. So think of energy and mobility transitions. Whereas transformation in itself is an open-ended reconfiguration of socioeconomic relations that can emerge through a series of transitions, but it culminates at a societal scale. It reworks power, culture, and spatial relations. So the evaluative line is transition moves within a system. Transformation alters what the system is. And this distinction is how I'm going to read the French materials and then the case study that I want to ground this presentation into. I had a lot of fun during my PhD doing illustrations because I'm a visual person, and I think that it's also easier to grasp some context, complex concepts through that. So I put the metaphor of a butterfly starting from a nymph all the way to, so we have the transition process happening and then the transformation happens at the end when we get the butterfly. And then an example is how short food supply chains, so transition practices, could help shift local food regimes, social relations, ecological ethics. So usually we notice that many initiatives, such as solar panel communities, local currencies, short food supply chain, like the example that I used, are branded as sustainability experiments, local labs, grassroots supports to socio-technical change, behavior, and local development nudges. But it's useful languages, but it's incomplete if you stop there. I mean, it risks placing these community economies outside the economic scope, when in practice, they are reconstituting it. So the analytic upgrade is to look for where this initiative act as ontological and institutional transformation, not just institutional support. Indeed, based on the works of the Community Economies Collective and Gilles and a lot of researchers in our community, we notice that community economies do not wait for transformation or wait for things to happen, but they practice it into being. So the reflection is the economy is performed in plural. People are already doing economics differently, remaking work, surplus, property, exchange, care. Transformation is everyday, situated, relational, embodied. And to showcase this, I'm going to talk a bit about France. I did my PhD on France because I'm from France, and I think that France has more than 200 years laboratory of associational economy, workers' cooperation, mutualism, and state negotiation that shows how these community economies have evolved from being repressed to being institutionalized, but also contributing largely to redefining how we do economy today. So stay with me. It's going to be a little bit of history course, but then the idea is to just show you how things have evolved in France. So after the French Revolution in 1789, 2 years later, we get this law, the Chapelier Law, that basically bans all worker association strikes, mutualism, and co-ops. because the revolutionary elite feared corporate bodies undermining market unity and sovereignty. So the state wanted to control these community economy, these initiatives, and then like subdue them for fear of that this would lead to another revolution, right? But then in 1948, we see the surge of workers' association and co-ops, and then there's a new republic. So unions are legalized, and this is mainly because the state needs to find alternative pathways to address urban industrial misery. And then this comes with the state using these community economics practices as spaces of experimentation and as spaces of support to a failing, let's say, mainstream welfare state approach. So this moves to 1901, where we have a law that finally enables nonprofit association that leads to massive civic organizing, especially with the need of the Republic to have some kind of consolidation, organized education, leisure, welfare beyond the state market. Of course, this leads to the explosion of associationism and community economies are building up and then gaining much more capacity. Then after the World War II, then we get the state reinforcing its dependency on these community economics practices to deliver mutual coverage, social security, and then a co-produced welfare. This helps them to gain scale and legitimacy. However, bureaucratization becomes a trade-off because they are legalized and being co-opted by the state to support with welfare state and then the creation of welfare and better livelihood for the population, there's this trade-off that is coming into the picture. So there's this notion of, let's say, instrumentalization that shows up. Then in the late 90s and then the 2000s, we notice what moves to a shift to services, cooperative banking that consolidates, and then the notion of decentralization that comes in, state retrenchment position and community economies as a proximity provider. So getting more into the territorial grassroots landscapes and using these community economies to reach out to various local communities. So in 2014, under François Hollande's presidency, we basically get a law that further recognizes all these community economies, so to support their financing and then their practices, and then also give them some kind of legal framework. However, this comes with some consequences, right? So there's the market and policy access, and then there's this huge instrumentalization that already started happening in the previous century that's kind of is heightened, and then this brings to the phase of tension that I want to focus a bit more in my presentation. However, the main takeaway from this quick overview that I just made was to show how workers' associations, mutual aid, and community economies did not just support the economy during this period from the revolution till now, but they challenged who could participate in it and on what terms, like looking at how they were banned and how they still went underground and still tried to make a case for themselves and getting to recognized. They showcased their capacity to lead to some form of rupture from the status quo. And then so this rupture included collective production and mutual insurance, democratic governance in this workers, mutuals and co-ops, and of course, inventing institutional forms later adopted by the state. So did not just prepare, let's say, live with modern capitalism, but it forced it to evolve in the terms of post-capitalism, as we can talk of it today. So I put a quick overview of what the social and solidarity economy law in France is. So for those who are not familiar with it, social and solidarity economy law in France basically looks at how community economies can be legalized, supported financially, and have a legal framework to avoid the informal approaches that comes with it, and then the kind of difficulties that might arise in terms of funding and then in terms of their governance. And then, so this was a way to shape it and also by the state to indirectly control it, right? So I will talk a bit more about how these initiatives that are concerned by this law try to circumvent and then also innovate to bypass some of these institutionalization practices. So a quick case study that I looked at during my PhD, I look at a local currency in France. There's more than 82 of them in France. I think the last time I checked, it's the country with the highest number of local currencies in Europe now. And then I checked a bit their genealogy through a number of interviews, and also I did a bit of participant observation with them. And then what we noticed is that there was a big emphasis on value, and then a big aspect of ecological rupture that came through. And then this started in 2009 after the post-Copenhagen disillusion, with activists from the Auvergne region convening to form alternative forums, because they realized that the COPs failed to answer some of the needs that we're having. And so they get inspiration from other local currencies that were already happening from across the globe, and of course transition towns, and then the Bristol pound and all of them. And then they start gaining some kind of momentum, and then they create a charter to govern their local currency, and then also live and do the economy differently till 2015, where they start officially circulating the currency and then creating a local economy. So this is a picture a bit of the different places in the Auvergne region where this currency is currently used. And then there's more than almost 2,000 people using this currency, and then more than 200,000 dooms that are in circulation. So each doom is equivalent to €1. And then what they are doing with this is very amazing, because they're providing zero interest loan, unlike traditional capitalist financing, to support businesses getting launched, and also creating a food social security system to help vulnerable communities in empowering themselves. So this is something that is redefining how economy is being practiced, and how financing initiatives is being done at grassroots levels. So this quick overview shows a bit how this community economies through the spectrum of Ladum is re-embedding value in place. So through their merchant networks, short for supply chain, democratic governance, so alternative approaches of governance through sociocracy, role rotation. And of course, there's a lot of conscientization that is happening. I'm thinking of Paulo Freire through the education campaigns and forum, and of course, institutional negotiation. So for instance, in the city of Clermont-Ferrand in France, where this currency is enabled, the municipality decided to join this currency as a member, and then they distribute, let's say, the wages and the honorariums of elected municipal officials through this currency to help them spend locally, and then circulate the money in itself in the local community. So we move beyond just transaction to interaction in the local community. So the transformational practice that we can take from here is the value of redefining value, and then also economic subjectivity. So what is the transition and transformation logic? The first one is an ontological one, because they look at the produce ethical and economic subjects, looking at caretaking, reciprocity, and the responsibility. So for instance, for the food social security system that the currency created to consume locally and support more vulnerable people of the community, we have people contributing money that is then redistributed equally amongst its members, so empowering the people that are partaking in these community economy initiatives. Then we have the institutional approaches that invents and reshapes the rules. We have the spatial and territorial approach, so anchoring of circuits of value and rescaling power locally. We have the reproductive aspect of it, and then also the networking that happens, because then they get trained by other community economy local currency, and then they also are helping create new local currency in different places in France. So we see that these are levers that change what the economy is, but not just how it performs. So they enact a new post-capitalist economy rather than just improving what we have already. Then the change in governance, we can look at who decides and how, reallocation of surplus to whom and by what rule. The subjectivity shift is what economic identities are normalized. And then we have this commons formation, looking at what is decommodified, what is shared, what is stewarded, and then the notion of territorial justice, whose capacities are expanded or constrained through these processes. Of course, there's some tension. I mean, I'm still focusing a bit more on this local currency to ground more the reflection. One would argue that because it's at a grassroots level and it's territorialized, in France, for instance, we have the small scale intervention that could only capture maybe a fraction of the area's transaction. So it can be looked as a complement and not a replacement. And then also there's this notion of inclusivity and reach, because what I notice is that most of the people that are early adopters tend to be educated, middle-class, activity-minded individuals, but lower income marginalized remain a bit more skeptical about these whole approaches. There's this huge issue of volunteer burnout and sustainability, because there's a huge or heavy reliance on volunteer team financial sustainability through possible small fees, but also they still need state subventions to help develop new programs and support. Then there's this notion of instrumentalization that I talked of. So the municipality became a member of it, but then they tend to, because they are members, they also become part of the board and then try to control a bit the narrative of these initiatives. But to what extent, that is another question. And then also there's a reflection on the broader systemic impact. Does the currency challenge the main root cause of economic injustice, or just mainly alleviate local symptoms? Then my question will be then, are these community economies just helping the system to transition, or are they already transforming what counts as the economy? I think that the genealogy that we looked at, both from the French historical aspect and also the local currency, showcases that they are actually transforming the economy, even though it's at the grassroots level and local, but then through their own networks and then how they do this kind of common and then share practices, they tend to diffuse their practices to other places, and then they are trying to transform the economy. If not, they are already transforming the economy with a bottom-up approach. And then I think it's the part that we have to look at more in the kind of research and discourses that we have around community economies. So my end note is that they are not just transitional mechanisms, but they are already transforming the economy through their socio-economic practices. Thank you. I'm done.
Fantastic. Well done. And done within time too. So that's fantastic, Gilles. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Really interesting, that distinction between transition and transformation. That's a really useful tool, I think, for thinking about these sorts of initiatives. And thank you for putting the take home at the beginning, the takeaway message.
Yeah.
That community economies is world making, which actually fits really nicely with Sangwon's presentation, and I suspect will fit really nicely too with Ella about those world making practices. So once again, thanks very much for that. So why don't we just take another 2 minutes to stretch while Ella gets her PowerPoint up. And the other thing I'm going to do, I'll just put in the chat the link to the abstracts. We've got a document that's got all the abstracts from the 3 sessions. I'll put that into the chat, and I'll also put a link to the Summer Winter School and a link to the Diverse Economies and Livable Worlds book series. So I'll do that while we just take a couple.
Great, well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I finished my PhD submitted it in 2024. So I feel a bit out of practice about talking about some of this. But I'm currently at Sheffield Hallam University, but I did my PhD at University of Sheffield. And it was called Bioregioning, a Politics of Place for Living Well Together. And for me, community economy scholarship was kind of really at the heart of it. Ooh, sorry, my slides are being a bit laggy. So I've got a beautiful picture there of Trondheim from the summer school, where we spent lots of time swimming in the fjords, and it felt like I couldn't come to this session without putting in a picture of Trondheim because it was so beautiful. But my PhD research was from 2019 to 2024. So by the time I was at the summer school, and I think Gilles was in a similar position, actually I'd done my field work, I was quite established in my PhD. And so the summer school was really about refining some of those ideas and kind of really bringing that community economies focus to it. I've also just noted here that I also did some research alongside my PhD with my co-authors, Sam, Maria, Christina, and Johnny, and some of their ideas kind of feature in this presentation as well. So I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledged that. So my PhD is probably quite different from Gilles and Sangwon's. in that it's looking very much at the kind of ontological level that community groups were working at, because the groups I was working with were really thinking about how they connected to place as part of their practice. So it was less about what we might describe as kind of explicitly economic practice, but really about how people were coming together to reimagine where they lived and what that opened up. So I've tried to put my kind of key takeaways up the front here, which is that for community economies, bioregioning really helps us to think about place. And it does that by creating a really progressive sense of place, which has a kind of attention to scale. It helps people build an awareness of interdependence and connection, both within their place and to other places. And it generates an openness to future meanings of place, as well as kind of how place has been made up to this point. So my PhD focused on groups that were using the idea of bioregionalism. And to kind of understand what bioregionalism is, you need to start with the idea of a bioregion. So literally just means bio meaning life and region meaning, I guess, region. So our life place is what bioregioning is about. And what underpins this is taking away kind of human arbitrary political boundaries that we create, and instead looking at natural landscapes. So that could be particular geological formations. A lot of people use watersheds as a way of doing this. Some people look at ecological systems or the range of keystone species. But the idea is taking away those human understandings of place and beginning with what is kind of given to us in nature as a starting point. So I've put in quite a lot of pictures because I worked with 2 case studies who I'll introduce shortly. But you can see here, you've got a kind of map of different habitats in Tayside, which is one of the groups I worked with, but also layering onto that the sort of social understanding of place and this idea that you sort of know when you're home and then you cross a boundary and at some point you end up somewhere else and you can feel that difference. And there's a kind of cultural association with place. So bioregions kind of bring those 2 understandings of place together. Bioregionalism is then a practice of living in place. I'm gonna have to make my screen a bit smaller so I can read this quote because I haven't got enough space here. But so Berg and Dasman, who are the kind of original thinkers of bioregionalism, describe living in place as following the necessities and pleasures of life as they're uniquely presented by a particular site. And that to kind of live sustainably, you have to kind of live in place in ways that are in balance with the region of support through links between human lives and other living things and the processes of the planet. So things like the seasons, the weather, and water cycles. So for many reasons, bioregionalism kind of got really popular and then it fell out of popularity. And I've written about the history of bioregional thought, and I'm not going to go into that in this presentation because it's a bit out of the scope. But what was really interesting for me was that this idea is starting to come back across the world, but in the UK in particular, and it's been coming back as a verb. So it's coming back as bioregioning. So for me, I was really interested in what is happening there. What is this idea doing? And what are the practices that people are doing? What is bioregioning? And so for me, community economies research is really helpful for thinking about bioregioning. It's because it's so place-based. So community economies scholars have always taken place seriously. And I think you can just see this in this idea from starting where we are to build new worlds with the things that we have at hand. So community economy scholarship has always kind of destabilized the idea that the global is inherently more powerful than the local, and has looked for examples of different economic practices, but also, as Gilles has talked about, different world building that's happening as well, and using the kind of tools and resources that we have in place to build and nurture new worlds. And within community economy scholarship, there's a huge amount of examples of these different practices that are taking place. And for me, bioregioning is really interesting because part of what they are doing is building their own inventories of different practices and different ways of thinking that exist in the places that they live. But as I'm sure we've all come across, place is still something that can be contested, and people still have this assumption that local is small and marginal, or on the other hand, that as social scientists that we might fall into the local trap and assume that the local is kind of inherently more democratic, and that we have this kind of naive assumption that there's something that's more romantic and beautiful, the kind of small is beautiful idea. Doreen Massey's also warned about a kind of reactionary sense of place, and identified that some social scientists assume that anything that's to do with a sense of place or belonging to place is kind of antagonistic to outsiders. So there's a really famous quote by Massey here, which is that we have this idea that place is kind of inhabited by coherent and homogenous communities, and that it kind of creates this defensive and reactionary response where you've got nationalism, a real kind of sentimentalized and sanitized idea of heritage, which kind of makes us antagonistic to outsiders. So anytime we're talking about place, people assume that's what's happening. And then Val Plumwood, who I'll talk about later as well, has kind of talked about relationships to place, and projects like bioregioning, which focus on place really heavily, kind of elevate our single home place, but ignore the actual places that sustain our livelihoods. So living in Sheffield, I've got a beautiful landscape that I might care for, but actually my food isn't produced here, my clothes don't come from here, and that by really focusing our love of place on the place we live is denying those other places, usually in the global south. So I put this quote here by Val Plumwood because she is quite explicitly critical of bioregionalism, which I think when you're starting out your PhD is a bit terrifying when you come across things like this, which are explicitly critical of the thing you're looking at. And she argues that communities should always be imagined in relationship to others, particularly downstream communities, rather than singular and self-sufficient. And that, bioregioning has come across a lot of critiques like this, that is really inward looking, that it connects people to a kind of idea of a native nature, and that can be extended to kind of people as well, that it become quite a nationalist way of thinking. So in this context, you've got this kind of re-emergence of bioregional thought in the UK. And as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of coming in this form as a verb. And I found this blog, which is the first time I found someone using bioregioning as a verb. And Tyler describes it as the act of bringing your bioregion into existence. So bioregion is a life place, as a place where you've got culture and nature and some kind of like relationship between them. So it's a kind of practice of bringing that back into if you believe that it has previously existed, but bringing it into existence. So this is really focusing on the process of change and the kind of practices of living well in a place with the people and the non-humans that you share it with. So for my research, I was interested in what is this idea of place doing for these groups? Kind of what sort of political subjects does it produce? And what are the practices that they are employing to do this? So I worked with two groups, so Bioregioning Tayside in Scotland. I won't go into them both in depth, but a little kind of flavour of what they're about. So in Scotland, there's really highly concentrated land ownership where people have been cleared from the land to create hunting estates and things like that. So there's a really big kind of community right to land movement. And Tayside is kind of almost in the centre of Scotland, and it sits along the Highland boundary, which is a fault line. So geologically, it's where you get the lowlands turn into the kind of more mountainous highlands. But historically, you would have had in the highlands a very clan structure, and the lowlands more agricultural, which were more easily colonised by the English. So it's quite an interesting site to look at. The second group I worked with was in Maine, in Casco Bay, and that was a really marine bioregion. They were really interested in the relationship between seagrass, oyster farming, sewage, things like that. They're really looking at the kind of water quality. And in particular, Casco Bay is one of the fastest warming systems on Earth at the moment. So there's lots of interest in kind of particularly like the water and the marine ecosystems that are happening there. So they were two quite different groups, but they worked together as well. And there were some quite interesting connections between them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the two key practices that both groups did in their kind of strategy of connecting to place. So the first one was called Story of Place. And this starts by building a regional profile of the bioregion. So they kind of chose some arbitrary boundaries for the area that they were talking about. And they looked in the present at the sort of demographics, the ecology, the climate, kind of what is the state of their bioregion, maybe some of the threats. So things like for Casco Bay being one of the fastest warming systems. But what was really interesting was then they did a kind of co-produced history of place. So they went back in time, did lots of research as a group and individually to really understand how their place has come to be managed or lived in certain ways. So for Tayside, the image here is the first panel of a timeline that they produced. The timeline itself, once they printed it out and displayed it, was 50 meters long. It's huge. And it goes right back, looking at kind of geological time. And they've mapped how the kind of landscape has changed, how the climate has changed, but they've added in a social history. So who's lived there at different times, who has moved, what have been the driving forces, what have been the key industries, and what are the factors shaping that. And they also added in what were the key paradigms. So what were the ways of thinking that were really shaping how people were using the land. So it's an amazing piece of work. And what was really fascinating was that shortly after they installed it, so you can see here, this is the front panel, but it actually continues down the street at the side, which you can't see. But very shortly after they installed it, there was a massive flood, and the water level came just poetically to the bottom of where the panels were. Because this was kind of picked up in the media as this really fascinating example of communities coming together to reflect on the impacts of climate and a changing climate on Tayside, and kind of really symbolically almost being flooded, but not quite. So this process of creating this history of place was something that was not just about understanding kind of the challenges that they faced or the resources they had to hand. It was a kind of political process of understanding yourself as part of a bioregion. So this first quote here, Carol, who was one of the kind of founding members of Bioregioning Tayside, was saying that actually looking back at seeing the patterns that were emerging through this like kind of long horizon view and thinking, how has this been going on for so long and how have we not done anything about it? So for her, this was quite motivating and mobilizing to understand that she was part of this place, she was part of actively making it and could be part of making something different. What was also really interesting to me was that although it was focused on one place, it was actually showing the connections between places. So Marie was talking here about working with the group in Casco Bay and saying that even though she was studying Tayside, she could see that the ties between the different places were global. And so she was working with the East Coast groups, and she could see how where people were being cleared from the land in Scotland, many of those people were going to areas like Casco Bay and clearing other people from their land. So you could see it had these kind of connections between places. So it wasn't an inward looking exercise. It was something that really connected people to different scales. So building on people's story of place, they then went on what they called learning journeys. So these were kind of extended periods of time learning together in place. So some of this was about spending lots of time looking at the landscape, understanding what signs of degradation are, maybe what risk factors for flooding were, so they become attuned to the landscape and the ecology. So kind of learning to be affected by what was there. They also went round and visited lots of different regenerative projects or place-based practices that they saw kind of being complementing the way that they were thinking. And they were describing these as green shoots of change. And by visiting them and networking them together, they kind of built this map of solidarity of different projects in the region that were working towards similar goals. From a kind of political level, they were coming together and taking on the position of learners. So it was quite democratic. There was no hierarchy there. Everyone was coming to be curious about the place and what could be done. And there was also this kind of building a kind of connection to place, connection to each other, and a sense of belonging that kind of became the basis for their political work. So the pictures on this slide are from Casco Bay. And so you can see we're out on the water looking at oyster farms. We were interested in the kind of relationship between oyster farming and seagrass, which was actually quite a symbiotic relationship. And at the bottom, we're walking around a sewage works because the sewage from the town of Portland kind of flows straight into the bay. And, you know, we're kayaking through the sewage and things. So it's really about kind of getting stuck into that landscape and really experiencing it. And these pictures are from Tayside's learning journeys. So the one on the left was an event in the wake of COP26, which was being hosted in Glasgow. And we walked up into the Cairngorms, and there was a storyteller who was telling a story about awakening the giants in this time of emergency. We had a carnix, which is a kind of extinct musical instrument that would have been played in these landscapes. And you can't quite see in the picture, but the children are bringing up offerings of kind of native saplings to the giant. So some of this is really leaning into maybe some more kind of stereotypical imaginations of what it is to be Scottish, but they were reimagining it in this kind of time of climate crisis of COP26 and saying, how can we create something new from this in a way that kind of creates belonging, but is still open to change and open to other people. So this quote here again from Marie was saying that these processes of story of place and learning journeys was about really connecting those different pieces of the past. So she knew about the Industrial Revolution, she knew about the clearances, she knew about big estates and bringing in sheep into the landscape, but she hadn't really connected them together to understand this societal and cultural changes that had enabled that. And by understanding those foundations, it was allowing her to think how you could remake place differently. So I don't want to run out of time. I can see my time is ticking away. But I just wanted to kind of pull out a couple of things that I thought were kind of interesting. And this wasn't a chapter within my PhD. It was more kind of a theme that ran throughout it. But for me, bioregioning was really understanding place as a process. So the practices of kind of story of place and learning journeys were about inventorying the tools, capacities, agency and resources for transformation that already exist in a place. They were about reframing narratives of place, again, understanding how place had been made, and it was contingent on a whole range of historical factors, but in a way that kind of opened that up to be remade differently. And it was producing collective political subjects where people were understanding themselves as a collective bioregional subject. And I haven't spoken about it in this presentation, but I was also thinking about how the more than human was part of that political subject and the agency of the landscape itself. So rivers in shaping the landscape and shaping what was possible. It was kind of this collective political subject rather than an individual subject who had to go away and do something about it. And it was understanding place as contingent on local, regional, and global influences, as something that was ecological, economic, and social, and something that was bounded, but also dynamic and open to change. And this is a lovely quote, which is saying that the power of bioregioning allows us to see our own thinking and the tacit agreements that we've made. So things like we're part of a globalized economy. It was a way of enabling people to rethink that. And just very last slide to close. So contribution to community economy scholarship. I think for me, this is really about if community economies are saying we need to start from where we are, bioregioning asks, where are we? And what do we have to hand? It's an example of this flat ontology and practice, where we can value place-based and context-specific alternatives, but remain attuned to scale. And place as a kind of site and a concept which enables resubjectivation, but it's beyond elevating a singular home place and accounting for, and it enables us to account for shadow places. And it's just one way that people on the ground are kind of making interdependence visible and beginning to act through ethical coordinates in that space of interdependence. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic and brilliantly timed. Well done, Ella. That's great. And I'm thrilled to see how you're reclaiming bioregioning. I first came across it in the late 1970s when my brother was studying, I think, Australia's first environmental sciences program, and he was introduced to bioregionalism, and we got so excited about it at the time. So I'm thrilled to see you coming back to it, but in particular focusing on those practices like storying and those learning journeys, which is a great way to think about bioregioning. So thanks for that. So how about we take a 2-minute break? How will that be for you, Kath? And then we'll come back and you're on mute.
I'm happy just to keep going, but if everyone else wants to stretch, that'd be fine.
Well, could we just do yeah,
Yeah.
Nikolai had to shoot off, and it looks like Stephen was here at the beginning, but he hasn't
I don't think
rejoined
he's
us.
going to be able to join us. He
No,
seems to
no.
have some
Yeah.
conflicts with childcare issues, so
Yeah.
that's a pity.
Anyway.
Never mind.
All
Yeah,
right. Well, if everyone's happy, we can just keep pressing on. Yep. Not that it's hard
Okay.
work or anything. Yep. Okay, great. All right. So, Kath, the floor is yours.
Ugh. Well, everyone, I've actually moved to get away from the people speaking in my house. How dare they talk over dinner, you know? I'm trying to get away from them so I can concentrate. Anyway, that was just fantastic. Wonderful to get the three of your kind of perspectives now on at least some of the work of the theses. So it's really wonderful. And congratulations on all of you getting through and doing these wonderful pieces of work. So there's some interesting connections between them all, I think. And, you know, the whole idea of trying to have or develop alternative subjectivities, I think the subjectivity theme really came through all three papers. So I think we could delve a bit into that. The other thing that came through, certainly in Gilles and in Ella's work, is the role of history, the whole sedimentation of past practices. And it wasn't in Sangwon's piece, but I'm sure there is an incredible history. I certainly know some of the recent history of the context in which he's working, but there's also a longer history there that I think, you know, might give some insight into how it is that this group of people have been able to, in that, you know, ultra-capitalist setting of Seoul, actually forge an incredible community economy, you know. So I'd love to think about that way in which what we inherit sets up a context for what's possible, and way in which we, perhaps in the case of Ella, you know, re-examining and getting back into that history is one of the elements that's going to be important in that process of resubjectivation. Not accepting ourselves as the individualized subject of neoliberalism is partly about looking at how that's been created and what's been lost in that history. So that was really a fascinating theme, I thought, that that comes through all. So, but maybe I'll just focus on each one in turn first now and just say a few things, as much as I can remember and do. And it was great, Sangwon, to get that insight into those elements of subjectivity that you're really pulling out, and the way that money and finance can be used in such a different way. It's almost as if they're decommodifying money, in a sense, like taking money out of that, the way in which obviously money predated capitalism, but the way in which money has become so much the vehicle for you know, getting more individualized profit making kind of thing. So that whole way of appealing to people to invest in something for the sake of it, and being willing to pay a community tax. I love that idea. I thought that was a fantastic concept, and it's something that could really be developed a lot further about reframing. You know, we're under a challenge to even talk about tax these days as a contribution to the social good. You know, people hate taxes. They want to get rid of taxes. They want them as less as possible, at the same time as saying we have to have a redistribution of wealth from the top to the bottom, and we need more taxes on them. But the whole discourse around tax has been kind of focused on, you know, what am I going to get back for my tax dollar, as opposed to how do I contribute to a Commonwealth? And yet here we've got a case of people at a much a more face-to-face scale developing their own sense of paying more as a form of a community tax to actually get the values for what, and getting what they need in a different way. So I thought that was a really fascinating insight. And I guess one thing I'm interested to find out more about is how the community currency operates in this context, which I know is another whole chapter of your thesis. But, you know, this community has its own moa, the kind of like a dollar looking printout, a bit like the one that Gilles talking about too. But it's been very instrumental in building connections between residents, between sellers in the local market, and community businesses and so on. And so that's another element, I think, of the way in which money is being taken over and used in a very different way. And so I think what's interesting, because I think at the moment in community economies thinking, one of the big challenges is how do we think about connection and integration and interdependence beyond the individual enterprise or experiment. And what you're showing here is a whole network of interrelated activities, whether it's the medical system, the vet, the cafes, the brewers, the local fresh food market, etc., and actually mapping out that way in which those transactions and integration is happening is I think a really important demonstration that it's possible to scale the community economy, as everyone wants to say. How do you scale? Well, this is still within the city scale, but it's much more than just each individual enterprise. So I think this is really pushing the work in interesting ways, and it'd be great to see, you publish on this and get it out there, I think. I love the way, you're really focusing on the embrace of a different kind of subjectivity in a context where I think many South Koreans, are so exhausted by the subjectivity that they're forced into through the education system, through the work system. And, we've seen that in some of the famous films that have come out of Korea recently, that kind of total abjection. And so to think, I think for many people to know that there's this going on in Seoul is a big surprise, that there's such a presence of social enterprise and social economy and actually grounded in a community like this. So, I think it's really, really fantastic work that needs to see the light of day. So moving on to Gilles' work, I thought that your whole kind of, you gave us a huge, from the French Revolution right up to now, that whole appreciation of associationism in France and the alternative history. I mean, you're reading history against the grain. Everyone will say, oh, we live in a capitalist world. But what you're showing is all these ways in which there's been a resistance to pure capitalist exploitation and individualization. And that history of associationism is really interesting. And the role that unions have played in there, of course, is quite interesting. And in a way, if you think about the welfare state or the way in which certain areas of economy have been are still in the hands of the state or in the hands of some kind of general social provision, there's been a resistance to the commodification of everything. And that associationism has been part of that. And so coming to the case of Clermont-Ferrand, where you're working with the local food system, I'm kind of interested in the role that unions might play in that food system, and to what extent they're still integrated in the kind of associationism that is part and parcel of that local food system. Because I think in a lot of our work in community economies, there's almost, I wouldn't say an opposition, but there's been an implicit critique of a lot of union activity that's been focused purely on getting better wages, but not on challenging the actual nature of the ownership and relationship. But again, that is very place specific, and I'm thinking perhaps more of an Anglo context rather than a European context. So, but anyway, I wanted to think about where the union movement that has been part of associationism fits within that local context. But, I think the idea of reordering the rules is a really important theme. And in a sense, all three of you are talking about that in a way, like reordering what the rules are that we live by, and how that infiltrates legal systems or the regulation and so on is, I think, a really interesting area of work that's going on now within community economies thinking, this idea of legal pluralism and the way that some of the laws can actually support the ethical practices that we're interested in. And so I'm interested to see whether there are any particular local regulations and laws that are really supporting that local food system, because it does seem to me that one of the big challenges is to really decommodify food, and it's happening in certain pockets. But how do we make it a much more generalized kind of practice? And probably the role of law and regulation is going to play a big role in that. And then Ella, I mean, fascinating work. again, another processes of resubjectivation, but coming at it through place and relationship to nature. And I guess when I was listening to you, I was thinking, how would this work in Seoul? Which is such an urbanized, built-up environment. It would be really interesting to think through with the community that Sangwon's worked with, to think of where does nature fit into this whole picture? What is the relationship to the natural world and the bioregion in a very highly urbanized context like that? Because you can see in the two places you've picked, there's a relationship to nature already, because it's somehow in the country to some extent, or on the coast, and yet it's bringing that bioregioning into cities. That's going to be is part of the challenge, I think, of dealing with climate change and changing our conception of how we live in the natural world. But those processes that you talked about, I think, are so important. That storying of place, and that can happen, I think, anywhere. It can happen in a city as well as in a rural area. So it'd be really lovely to see that bioregioning. I mean, people do it at the city scale. Like, I think of Sydney, they would think of the whole hinterland and everything. But I couldn't imagine how to do it in somewhere like Tokyo or Seoul. But I'm sure that would be an interesting challenge to try and move this kind of work into that kind of context. But again, it's another. I love the way you brought in the shadow places argument and the interconnections that are not just within the local economy, but how people to appreciate the situation with respect to others on the other side of the world. And obviously migration and that displacement and migration is a really interesting way of doing it. And yet it's something that's being so weaponized at the moment. And, all of us are migrants to some extent, certainly not Aboriginal Australians, although, thousands and thousands of years ago, maybe. But how do we allow people to have those stories and appreciate the role that migration and displacement and enclosure and so on has played in their either relative advantage or relative disadvantage, and do it in a way that isn't so scary, or that doesn't feed into right-wing politics, which is so happening at the moment. So interesting to see where the bioregioning in a political sense could be really used in the current context to try and calm people down a little bit and actually learn to empathize with all of us, and especially because we're on the cusp of a time when I think there's going to be massive displacement because of climate change. How do we prepare ourselves for that kind of thing? I think the changing nature of bioregions because of climate change is really part of that story. So it's like bringing the history to bear on the future. And I hope you're going to keep working in this kind of vein, because it's a really important one. But I'd love to see how they might come together with all three in all three places. So, but I guess they're my comments at the moment. I feel like you're all doing really rich work that's in a sense kind of pushing the boundaries of thinking, and really appreciative of the work you've done. So thanks. Let's open it up.
Yeah, thanks, Kath. Well, before we do that, I just wondered if any of the comments that Kath has made, whether they've provoked anything for you, for Ella or for Gilles or for Sangwon, that you would like to just say in response to what you've heard Kath say. Gilles.
Yeah, I had a quick one because it's an interesting Katherine made an interesting reflection about the role of unions in these local food systems, and something that I really found interesting during my field work, especially let's say in the early post-COVID era. So when I was doing my field work, which was of course a bit impacted by COVID, but it was also interesting because I had a chance to visit farms. We know that farmers are really busy, and then it was a bit of a down season for them, if I can put it that way. And then an interesting thing that I noticed, and some of the farmers told me, at least in one of the case studies, was how the unions and then these big farming corporations, they moved from seeing, at least in the local context of Clermont-Ferrand and where I'm working, from seeing these local initiatives as competitors to how do I lost the word.
Agribusiness or big
No,
business?
they moved from
Agriculture?
seeing
No.
them as competitors to teammates, to people they could work with, basically, because
Okay.
there was this issue in doing things in silos. They couldn't work in silos anymore, and they realized that they could develop a kind of collective approach to things. So, for instance, there's a federation of bioproducers that was created that encompassed these corporations that were doing bioproductions and unions, and then small-scale local farmers. So kind of mutualizing their resources. So for instance, I spoke to a farmer that said that, well, I have my poultry farm, we produce eggs, but we cannot supply for the whole neighborhood. So we are partnering with this little business there that is also supporting with extra produce from their farm. And then we are using the same bus. So maybe on Mondays I'm going, on Wednesday she's collecting my produce and going to the market. And I find it really interesting that they move beyond the notion of competition. Of course, it's still at a smaller scale, but then I really found it interesting how in times of crisis, there's this willingness to go beyond just thinking about ourselves, which could be the case generally, yeah, when we talk about survival instinct, but then they started thinking about how might we work together to respond to the local needs. I mean, it could sound a bit utopian, but then it was something that I noticed that I found really interesting to create this federation, and they even created the platform. So again, it's at a really smaller scale, but then it also gives an idea of what could be the possibilities when we focus on finding solutions for the community instead of focusing on economic livelihoods for the individual. So that was something interesting that I found. And also about the law supporting or the scaling or decommodification of food systems. What I found also interesting, and this is also at the Clermont-Ferrand level. So what we should keep in mind is Clermont-Ferrand municipality, the mayor is a socialist. So he comes also from a community economies, they don't call it that way, we call it social and solidarity economies in France background. And he's been really big in supporting these short food supply chain systems, especially the ones that are trying to create these food social security systems for students. And then they've actually supported in creating in financing, let's say, a place where people, associations, buildings where students can go and take food, and also create this kind of networks, this community where farmers can also give unsold food, and then they created quality standards. So you just don't give what is not good anymore, but things that are still of quality. And then this brings to the question of instrumentalization, because is the municipality doing it for political leverage? Or are they doing it because of their own values and then their own reflexivity on these questions of food insecurity and also empowerment of this population? So it's a question that is there, and then I'm still trying to understand what
maybe
is
both.
them. Yes, what is in
Maybe.
for them,
Yeah.
and then so I find it interesting to see that it's not a binary approach, and which again is what our own reflection is. It's about not finding how things are working and how we are making new economies. And then so I think the comments are really, really interesting, and then they bring more reflections for me to also invest more time in investigating this aspect. So thank you so much, Kat, for this feedback. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that cuts across all three, to some extent, maybe less, Ella, I don't know, is this idea of social infrastructure. And what you've just described there is a kind of a form of a social infrastructure that allows for other connections to happen, and how important that is. Yeah. But yeah, there may be others. Have you got responses? I don't know.
Yeah, Ella or Sangwon?
I can jump in really quickly. I mean, I think the point about bioregionalism being quite rural is definitely something that is true, but there's lots of people doing interesting work about bioregions as an urban model and as a way of connecting between the urban and the rural, particularly in China. And people doing some really interesting stuff, looking at gut microbiomes and saying, how do we use that as a kind of entryway into thinking about your bioregion? And I did some work with some architecture students who are trying to conceptualize a Yorkshire bioregion, which is the area we're in, but looking at the transport links. So saying, well, what materials could we bring into Yorkshire by train? And then that could be the way we're thinking about bioregions. So there's lots of interesting ways that people are reconceptualizing it. But I think also sometimes with bioregioning, there's a tendency to say anything that is place-based, people who are kind of involved in bioregioning go, oh, that's bioregioning. And actually sometimes it's something different, and that's okay. And it's, you know, politically and ontologically different, even though they both draw on place. So it may be that for the urban, the bioregion isn't the most useful concept, but people are trying to use it. So yeah, I'll leave it there to let people jump in.
Right.
Yeah. Sangwon, do you want to
Yes,
respond to anything?
just quickly, I also thought bioregion can be a concept that could be used in highly urbanized settings, as in my case studies, and also broadly speaking, urbanistic, where the city has been made from scratch, basically, during the Cold War era, and in the context of the Cold War politics, the cities has been utilized as a political tool to display their political prowess. So it's mostly about, for the past 60, 70 years in the history, it has been idealized that, you know, just build a city from scratch, get rid of everything that doesn't seem to be a city, and then property-led urban development project has been so prominent. So to the extent that where people cannot really think of nature or modern human as part of their lives in cities, but as climate change becomes a serious issue, it's not as serious in Korea as it is in the Europe, but still, I think bioregion and the modern human kind of thinking can be useful to think about cities in elsewhere too. And also, on other note, social infrastructure is actually my another empirical chapter. So my another chapter is about social infrastructure. I talk about community organizations and this financial, like Rose Cards and community stores as social infrastructures. So I would, if there's another chance, I would love to share that findings too. And the thing that I haven't mentioned in my presentation about this financial subjectivity is about as Katherine said, the community currency and Rosca, basically. The chapter, Modern Capitalist Economies of Alternative Urbanism, the chapter is divided into two different sections. One is about this financial subjectivity, and another one is about Rosca, basically. So in my case study, people develop the community currency, and people can use the currency in the network of community stores. So people can actively cultivate and nurture this kind of caring relations between individual and also these community organizations and stores by using money and by taking seriously the implications of their spending. So I think it could also be linked to what Gilles talked about in his presentation too.
Yeah, it's like you know, there was a lot of interest a long time ago in let schemes and community currencies, and then it sort of dropped by the by a little bit. And now we can see that they're very crucial in terms of building these connections, and many of them have lasted a long time. That I know, like Pete North did a lot of work, wrote a book ages ago on these, but it's almost like, yeah, I think they've sort of dropped out of prominence to some extent. So it's sort of interesting to see your work bringing them back, both of you bringing them back to the fore and looking at what they're doing beyond just doing the exchanges in a different way, like how they're kind of allowing different kinds of connections to actually be consolidated. So it'd be nice to kind of rethink that, I think, a little bit more. Yeah. But again, I thought, as Jen mentioned, it was great that Maliha and Yaya's chapter in the handbook has been so helpful, because again, they were challenged to think about how do we write about finance. I thought they did an excellent job in sort of fleshing out different aspects there, which is great, and it's really nice to see it being picked up.
Great. So are there any thoughts from anyone else then? Any ideas that have been provoked for you?
I'm wondering, Tom, how this relates to the book that you and Nadia have been working on in terms of the which
specifically
I
around
haven't
that
had a
book.
chance to read, unfortunately, but I know other people in the CERN Europe have been reading some of it. Yeah,
it's getting there. It's been a long collective project, but no, there were some other things for sure that I'd like to jump into. Like this question of currencies and interconnections and how currency is changing. We had this session with Will Ruddick, who's a member of CERN, about commitment pooling and his work around digital currencies. And he's got these incredible diagrams and visuals of how they're creating local currencies, but using digital technology to allow exchange between them and to really negotiate valuation between them. And it becomes quite complex thinking about it. And he's got a book that he just wrote with some nice insights into how he's doing that. And that was one thing just coming to mind. But I was really interested in various things that came up. I thought, Kathy, your comments really brought these already great projects together, and the comments really brought out these commonalities, which I enjoyed. On Ella's presentation, I had this question, a brief one, I guess, is what bioregioning doesn't seem to be one thing anymore, I don't think, or maybe it never was, but these new forms of bioregioning that I'm seeing, they seem to be different in nature to this like 70s, maybe ecocentric or biocentric or environmentalist. And I'm seeing a lot of externally led, I don't want to sort of caricature it, but sort of tech bro, crypto, US based initiatives in Latin America, for example, and whether bioregioning can be sort of, or is emerging sometimes as, is it done in partnership always, or is there some, like, I don't know if this is an interest of yours or something, if it's something you've noted or seen as well. And I would just like to see how that's emerging globally in a different way nowadays, because it's a term that's always interested me, but I'm now seeing it done in ways that I would be maybe ethically dubious of. And with Sangwon's really interesting case study, I also, the notion of history came up for me. Like, I don't know enough about this context. I don't know, in your thesis, do you go into the history of cooperativism in South Korea? Are these initiatives in the city drawing on sort of older forms of exchange that existed already, or is there sort of a Western introduction? There were lots of questions that arose for me on who's involved and how they're breaking down, when you talk about money, sort of who holds the money and who's able to participate, and then how you break that down in these cooperatives, which you mentioned a little bit already or hinted at. Basically, I just found this session really stimulating and thought-provoking. Gilles, as well, with your the French context, I find really interesting. I recently was working or helping someone on a thesis around this Scopti tea. It's a recuperated tea production facility that was owned by a giant corporation, but the workers took it back recently, and and it was a union-led cooperative, sort of a union-led retaking of this factory and the creation of a cooperative out of it. And it also links to bioregioning in that they are now that the corporation isn't involved anymore, they're trying to sort of source ingredients locally, and they're going through this process of sort of regional sourcing and sort of re-stimulating that local economy around the tea. So there was like these links between bioregioning, cooperatives and unions and things like that going on as well. But yeah, just some thoughts from the top of my head.
Great. Do any of the presenters want to respond to anything that Tom just said?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always keen to talk about sort of ethically dubious bioregioning as well, because it's something I have come across, and I think kind of it was sort of like around the time I was doing my field work, and like came across some of the people that you're talking about, and that was really unsettling for me. And I did some work with the scholars that I mentioned, and we were looking at different global examples of bioregioning. We talked about Australia and the kind of political stakes being very different to what they are in the UK. And we spoke to some of the kind of more techie American examples of this. And as you say, some examples of people who had essentially bought up vast, like, acres of land in Southern and Central America. And you talk to them and they go, well, what we need, their view is totally different. They're saying what we need is as many bioregional experiments as possible, because evolution has told us that 90% of innovations will fail. It doesn't matter that we are not indigenous, because after society's collapsed, we will be the new indigenous. And that, to me, you're just like, whoa, that's not what I'm interested in. And I think what was interesting for me was that the groups I was working with in Scotland and in Casco Bay, they were kind of aware of that politics, and they were aware of those people, and they were kind of saying, well, this is the process that we're going through. We're doing it through these ways of seeing all of these possibilities of where that politics can go, but we're not going there, and we're using this part of the idea that we find useful, and we acknowledge that happens, and we can see sometimes that slippage, but by kind of really focusing on the process of doing this work, that's how we kind of eliminate that, and that's how we build our own movement. So from my kind of research point of view, that's what I tried to do, is kind of acknowledge that that's the work that they were doing, and using a kind of diverse economies ethics there to say, not take the worst example of this and then use that to undermine the work that the groups that I was looking at were doing, and saying, well, actually they're aware of that, they navigate this, and they're not totally naive about it, but they're trying to do something different. So some of the papers that I wrote with Sam, Christina, Maria and Johnny, we kind of explored a little bit of some of those different ways that bioregioning is being expressed. But yeah, my PhD couldn't quite like absorb all of that as well. But yeah, I have encountered it, and it's kind of interesting that this language, because it can encompass so much, and people like the flexibility of it, because it allows you to have it mean different things in different places and to different people. It then means it can be used in ways that people don't agree with, and you kind of get lumped together. So yeah.
Fascinating. Sangwon or Gilles, did you want to make a response to Tom?
Yeah, I'll just quickly pick
Yep.
up on the point on history. Recently, this community has celebrated their 30th anniversary. So the community itself has a long-standing history of making alternative urbanism in central Seoul. But what sets this community really apart is the ways in which they engage with the notion of ma을, which refers to how people used to organize their lives back in the days where city was not a thing, back in the day where Korea was not so urbanized. So it's a kind of a nostalgic term that invokes an image of people standby living together, especially in the context where they don't have institutional support and thus kind of a welfare sort of provisions that is considered normal in the modern history of this country. And the notion of ma을 is inherently open-ended, so different people have different understanding of this notion, but still it allows people to think about different ways of living together, and it allows people to engage with others and develop kind of a ethical orientations towards others, just because the notion of ma을 itself underscores there are different kind of socialities that we can think about. So it is not just bringing the nostalgic term back in the city, but it is reclaiming kind of social relations that we can bring about in contemporary urban settings. So, and what was interesting to me during my fieldwork is the community organizations activities that has endured relatively longer time have always been engaging with this notion of ma을 explicitly, but there are some other newly established activities that has inspired a lot by the notions of like urban commons, the concept, the intellectual, scholarly concept that have been introduced by urban scholars who studied abroad, mostly in the US. And the thing is, where there are community organization who purchased the building in support of the then city government that was progressive in nature. But the thing is, they think about these urban commons as a property. So they believe once they buy this building, so then everything can be unfolding in a way that they imagined. But the thing is, when I visited their building, when I visited their meetings multiple times, they cannot really think about what they can do in the building because they are suffering so much from the fluctuating market interest rate. So all their concerns have been always focused on how can we pay back the rent, how can we pay back the interest. So I think there is a interesting contrast or dynamic in between this more indigenous idea of living well together and the kind of concept of waste that can be considered imported by the West, so to speak. So these are the things that I want to reflect on a little bit more in the future.
Great. Gilles, did you have anything very quickly to respond to for Tom?
To be honest, no, because it was more of a comment than a question. So I think I will leave it as that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, look at that. We're spot on my 10 p.m. Some people's 8 a.m. Some people's 8 p.m.
8 p.m.
All right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And Colm, you'll be you'll be doing your presentation in a few hours' time, so we hope that goes well. And as well as these wonderful presentations that we've had from Ella and Gilles and from Sangwon. And it's fantastic to just see how the work has developed from doing the summer winter school. So we're really appreciative of, the way you've picked up and worked with the material and produced fantastic pieces of work. Yeah. So thank you, everybody.
I'm so glad that it's being recorded, because I know there are a lot of people that would love to listen to this that weren't able to make it to these times. So I'm hoping, and perhaps future summer school students will listen to it too. So thanks so much for such excellent presentations. So great.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.